This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Regenerative agriculture is the focus of today's Spotlight podcast, brought to you interruption-free by Proximity Malt. Proximity Malt is the first new generation full-scale regional malting facility in North America, and they lead the way in malt supply with premium grains, advanced technology that maximizes flavor, performance, flexibility, and efficiency, regional sourcing for closer, fresher grain, and a deep focus on closing the loop between farm, maltster, brewer, and the communities that support each. We're going to talk about an important part of that today, Proximity's focus on regenerative agriculture and what that means for everyone from farmers growing barley to brewers making beer with it. We'll talk about what it means, why it's important from not just an ecological, but also financial perspective, the impact regenerative practices can have on malt flavor and quality, and a lot more. We have all sides of that conversation reflected here in the room with me. Walker Modick, Environmental Program Director for New Belgium and Bell's Brewery. Welcome to the podcast, Walker.
Thank you so much for having me. Treat to be here.
Joining us remotely from his farm in the San Luis Valley of Colorado, barley grower, co-owner of Spare Keg Brew Works, Derek Heersink. Welcome, Derek.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
Derek's out there in the fields right now, might even be on the combine harvesting as we talk through this podcast. And so we've had to patch him in remotely. Also joining me here in the office, Zach Gaines, commercial director for Proximity Malt, someone who's spent a lot of time in the world where beer and grain meet. Welcome, Zach.
Thanks for having me on today.
It's exciting to have this conversation. Anyone who's listened to the podcast knows I love to talk about farming, and we'll certainly do that through this episode today, but we'll also unpack what this focus on regenerative agriculture can mean for breweries themselves, how they can tell the story in a way that connects with their customers, how lowering inputs on the agricultural side benefits everyone, and much more. Thanks to Proximity Malt for partnering on this episode. Let's kick things off with some quick introductions. Walker, let's start with you. Why don't you give us your background and how you ended up in this role with New Belgium and Bell's?
Oh boy, that is a long story. You can feel free to give me hand signals
when I'm going too deep.
Version of that. Try and keep it elevator pitch. I was working at the Environmental Protection Agency and moonlighting at a small craft brewery in Durham, North Carolina. And ultimately, sustainability and craft brewing was sort of the combination of the two and where I wanted to be. And I was lucky enough to get a job in craft sustainability at Bell's Brewery back in 2013, and occupied that role for just about a decade before Bell's and New Belgium became a single entity. And now I'm lucky enough to focus on the environmental portion of our sustainability work for New Belgium and Bell's breweries across the entire enterprise.
Derek, why don't you give us a little bit of your background elevator pitch? Now, you're a farmer, but also a brewer.
Yeah. So my family, my family moved to the San Luis Valley in 1897, and we've been farming here ever since then. We've been doing a lot of barley and alfalfa, and to this day, I still do barley and alfalfa, and then I'll rotate in field peas every once in a while, maybe some oats here and there, but generally mostly barley and alfalfa. I graduated from CSU in 2011 with soil and crop science and ag business, and just really wanted to look at new ways to do things on the farm and get what we're doing out to the public. And one of the ways to do that was to start a brewery. So my buddy Mark Martinez and I started Square Peg Brew Works in 2017. We had to change our name in 2021 to Spare Keg. And then Mark actually passed earlier this year from a heart attack, but we've been going strong with the beer and trying to connect farm tap and to get people realizing where their food and drinks come from. So it's been a fun journey, and I'm excited to continue on showing people new and different ways to try and do it.
Well, our condolences on Mark's passing. You all also won a GABF gold medal for historical beer in 2017.
Yeah, we did a Dutch Coit that we call the Waverly Tulip. And that was a fun experience. We didn't have any intention on winning or anything. And then we started getting a bunch of text messages saying congrats. So we figured we better rush over there and get our medal. But it was a fun time. But yeah.
For sure. And Zach, you've been around beer for most of your. You even wrote a graduate master's thesis on on beer.
I did. Yeah, that was that was. It seems like a long time ago, but yeah, I started my career in Fort Collins at ABI's barley breeding program. So yeah, first job was working on the creation of new genetics and designing new raw materials, for big beer at that time. And then had an opportunity to work in Los Angeles as a brewing manager for ABI and Van Nuys at their plant. And then, went to graduate school and studied ag business at K-State. And I was trying to determine what factors drove consumption, of what the key factors were that drove consumption. And that was a long time ago. I think that thesis project was probably worthless about 5 years after. That was before the big craft boom, before the big craft beer boom.
You were considering this at a time in the mid 2000s when craft beer, was actually declining. I mean, that was the last time that we saw craft beer actually drop in terms of number of breweries. So interesting. Yeah,
but it was a cool project. And then I spent about a decade with a French breeding program called Limagrain. They did in North America here. They're working on wheat varieties and then malting barley, which was, for me, always the most exciting part, was trying to find new genetics, sometimes on the other side of the world, just to see how they'd work on U.S. soil. And eventually, I was going to end up with a malting company with my background. I've been very cool to be a part of the proximity team for the past 4 years. I started as the raw materials guy, so making relationships with farmers, trying to put new genetics in their hand, mostly learning from them. But we have an incredible group of growers here in Southern Colorado. At some point, I think during the podcast, we got to talk about just the agronomic possibilities down there, because it's the Audubon Speedway of yield in the U.S. So very cool to have a malt house right in the middle of that. But yeah,
I'm super tempted to be a Colorado homer because obviously this has been my home state for the last 15 years. I'm going to try to avoid that, but I will just say that this nexus of agriculture, of barley, wheat, of beer making, and of truly phenomenal water has certainly led to Colorado being an important place in that world of beer. And that's actually one of the reasons we're here. Well, tell us about proximity. Going through a major investment to create a new malt company with actually, multiple locations at the time Proximity is a pretty big gamble.
It was. I think the founders of Proximity, they wanted to try and do something differently, but they started with locations. I think we have a malt house here in Southern Colorado, which we've spoken about, and we have another one in Laurel, Delaware, which is very non-traditional in terms of where you're going to grow barley, at least historically for beer. But they wanted to put malt houses in the middle of farms. In the middle of the San Luis Valley was a very easy decision. Coors has been sourcing there for a long time. You have incredible growers. Out in the mid-Atlantic, that was more of a gamble. And we're about 9 years in from when both plants originally opened up, so coming up on a decade. And, finding winter malting barleys that, two-row winter malting barleys that can compete in terms of extract and enzymes and all the things that brewers need, that's been a challenge out there, but it's something that's been accomplished with the help of AMBA and some university breeding partners. So getting the raw materials right was step one. Slowly over the course of, 3-4 years building an international customer base where proximity can, try and reach just about everywhere in terms of the continental U.S. Was the second challenge. But I do feel like, we're not a craft maltster, but we're certainly not one of your big multinationals either. We like to use the phrase regional. And, I think our relationships with our farms, which is really kind of where this whole conversation started that we're having today, is something that's been really impactful, and it's been cool just to be a part of that.
Well, tell me about that. What do you mean by that conversation with the farms? It's interesting to put a malt plant in and then think, hey, now we have to build a supply chain of barley to feed this. Obviously you're there in the mid-Atlantic. There's lots of breweries around you too, and lots of potential customers that love to have that story of connection to local ingredients. But, farmers grow what they have, what they can sell. They don't grow things with a hope of being able to sell it at some point in the future. They're not going to put it in the ground if they don't have a market for it. And so you had to basically create a market for them.
We did, and we have to be competitive versus their whatever other option they have in any given year. And I think, here in Colorado, being able to go to the San Luis Valley, again, malting barley is a very well-known, I won't call it a commodity. I still believe it's an ingredient, in that area. But being able to go to someone like Derek, I didn't have to have any conversation with Derek about how to hit agronomic targets, how to keep, he's an exceptional grower without proximity. It was a different conversation in the Mid-Atlantic where you had to talk to someone who was used to growing soft red winter wheat for yield and say, hey, we want you to grow malting barley. You may not get the same yield, but you are going to make more money. And we need you to think about yield as maybe the fifth most important thing, which they look at you like you're crazy when you say that. And you tell them we've got to have really high test weight. We have to keep our protein low. We have to keep our plumps very high. We have to keep fusarium head blight and subsequently dawn out of this grain. And then if you can do all those things correctly, then yes, as much yield as you can get. But it's a much different conversation. And so it's been a work in progress out there just in terms of growing with the growers. So they are personal relationships that you have. And again, some producers pick it up faster. They understand it takes them a couple of seasons to get used to new genetics, to get used to different input strategies. But yeah, so the fact that you know them, you end up knowing them really well. You're out walking barley with them a couple times a year and, doing what you can to help them, make sure they have resources, because ultimately you want them to succeed. The worst thing that can happen is a new producer or a producer who's new to malting barley takes a chance, has a bad season, has their barley rejected, could have done better with wheat. That's not the type of experience that they're going to come back next year excited to grow for you.
So tell me, you mentioned that yield is number 5 on your list. What these other, 4 elements ahead of it are, and maybe we can loop Derek in to explain what some of those details really mean.
Yeah. We start with test weight and protein. I don't know that I would say one is more important than another, but, test weight is highly correlated to extract. So the higher the test weight you have in our barley, the higher the predicted extract we're going to be able to provide to a brewing customer. So, in the San Luis Valley, if producers can hit 52 pounds per bushel, an average test weight would be 48 pounds per bushel. Regularly, producers in the San Luis Valley hit 52, 53. We've even seen 54 pounds. That's an extract machine in terms of malt. And then keeping protein low, which is largely a genetic component. You find the right genetics that are already low. But I do think, there are a lot of different environmental conditions, agronomic conditions, which Derek knows, probably much better than I do, where you keep that manageable. And then if you can keep the protein low, the test weight high, generally your plumps are going to be pretty high as well. And you end up with something that a building block, I'll call it, that we can take and turn into an exceptional ingredient.
Derek, from your perspective, what are some of the factors that you as a farmer, use that, can help manipulate some of these factors that Zach's talking about?
So as far as protein's usually one of the biggest things that I'm worried about as far as the malt side goes. in growing the malt barley. If you stress it at the wrong time with water, or you give it too much nitrogen at the wrong time, you can jump up your protein levels a whole bunch, and it's hard to get them back down. We really just try and keep it wet, especially when it's starting to make that grain, and not to stress it out. You can manipulate it a little bit with water to try and keep it a little bit shorter. I know varietal wise, we like shorter barley because it helps with keeping it standing. If you have a tall barley that's yielding high, it's probably going to lodge and end up on the ground. And then we have sprout issues and mold issues and all that stuff. So we like a sturdy, short barley. So this Leandra that we're using in some of the stuff with proximity is a lot like that. Yields good, stays short, finishes fast. We've got some older varieties that like to get a little bit taller and not yield as much, but still fall over more. So definitely always looking at newer genetics that can help you achieve what you want with less water and less inputs.
Sure. So that less water and less inputs brings us to the subject, the real focus that we're here to talk about today in terms of regenerative agriculture. Zach, why don't you set the groundwork for that?
Before you jump in there, Jamie, I would just say, love the way the conversation has started, because we're talking quality and we're talking price first. And if you can't make a product that is at or above market quality and keep it at or below market price, you're never going to get to play in a sustainability space. Because if you don't deliver quality and you don't control price, it doesn't matter what you're doing on the sustainability side, your business won't be around long. And that we've naturally come to this point in the conversation in that chronology, I think, is just a nice little nuance to the conversation so far, and certainly one that needs to be pulled forward before we get in the weeds around regenerative practices, sustainability, etc. The importance of being able to deliver quality and do so at cost.
Yeah, if it doesn't perform in the brew house, it doesn't matter how good it is, from a theoretical perspective, like no one's going to use it. And if it doesn't make good tasting beer and it doesn't give you the kind of, extract per dollar that you're searching for as a brewer, then all the everything else is worthless. But those are table stakes now, right? Amongst all ingredient producers, like it has to work. And if it doesn't work for brewers, then it's not going to live long. So now that we established that, talk about this approach to regenerative agriculture. Now, in the last 5 years, we have watched, in this post-pandemic world, even for us at the magazine, we watched the chemical plant that produced the UV coating for the cover of the glossy magazine go offline for 6 months. And all of a sudden, we couldn't put a glossy coating on the cover of the magazine for 6 months because they just weren't making it. And, so inputs changed our calculus around those things. Agriculture requires lots and lots of inputs, typically, fertilizer, pest control, all the other kinds of things. Lots of those are driven by or produced from petrochemicals. So there's lots of stuff going on around this. There are other ways to do it, however, and you guys, I think, both in terms of trying to reduce the load of extra stuff going on here, but also reduce that kind of chemical, but also reduce the cost of those inputs. All of those things work together to create an idea behind regenerative agriculture that is not just driven by, hey, let's do the right thing for the earth and pie in the sky thinking, but also, hey, how can we control input costs and do this more effectively in a way that also does all these other things? Tell me if I'm wrong, but that's, I think, a general framework for this.
No,
one thing that I would stress is that regenerative doesn't mean less chemicals. Okay. If anything, my chemical use has gone up, especially on pest and weed control, because I don't have, with doing my no-till situation, I don't have the ability to do mechanical weed killing. So I have to rely on chemicals and the type of chemical I use way more to keep my weed pressure down.
But there's a soil benefit then to this too.
The soil benefit is, the less you mess with the soil, the better your structure stays, the better your microbes are, the better just the diversity in life is in the soil. And when I say use the right chemicals, it's the ones that get the job done without hurting anybody else. So I want to use things that aren't hurting my beneficials, that aren't hurting my soil microbes, stuff like that. But we can't say that we use less. It's just different and different applications and timing and such.
One of the things I try and be careful about, I like regenerative practices because it really is a suite of different strategies, and every grower needs to have the ability and the opportunity to turn the dials and pull the levers that work for that grower. And so I think as Zach talks through some of those practices, and if we were to, survey a number of Zach's different growers, we'd find that there's a whole host of regenerative practices being implemented. And sometimes the banner regenerative wholesale can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so practices, I think, is sort of the safe spot for me in terms of what we're doing, is definitely bringing on a lot of new regenerative practices. But what one person would consider regenerative agriculture can vary dramatically compared to another.
That's fair. You're right. And since all of agriculture is local to where those fields are and things are being grown, those practices are going to vary based on what the climate and what the crops and everything else require from them. Zach, from your perspective at Proximity, what does that mean for you all?
Yeah, I mean, this is all very valuable perspective, and I'm glad Derek shared that, because almost immediately we took the idea of a one system approach and threw it out the window. And what I mean by that is, there was never going to be a time that we were going to say, hey, this is regenerative agriculture, and if you can do all these things, you can be a part of our program, which is to say this is right and another way is wrong. And it is literally, I think we're in year 3 of our regenerative program. I think we're working with about 40 different farms this year. It's 40 different conversations. Every one of those farms has their own ability, if that's the right word, to adopt regenerative practices. And so the way we started was we defined principles of soil health. And so our program was essentially based on 5 things that we're looking at. The first one, we're asking producers to look at no-till or minimum till. And by minimum till, we're talking about, vertical tine tillage. You're talking about the top inch of the soil, managing residue to a point, not getting deep in the soil. So I think that, that's where we start. If we have producers who are going to
And what do you start there? What is the benefit of not tilling?
So starting with tillage, you're talking about, where organic agriculture is about what's happening on top of the soil, or what's being applied or not applied on top of the soil. With regenerative, you're talking about something that you can't see. You're talking about what's happening underneath, in the top 18 to 36 inches of soil. So that microbiome, if it's left alone, a lot of amazing things are going to happen in that microbiome. If you're going to go through and do moldboard plow, deep type tillage, you're going to turn that soil over, and you're going to destroy what's happening underneath the soil. So, and that's why we start there. Because, if a producer is going to do deep tillage once a year, our programs, it's probably not going to be a fit for them. So we start there because, Derek mentioned it. What we're trying to do is build soil structure or increase the health of the soil, which is why the second thing we talk about in terms of cultural practices is cover crops. And really what we want producers to do is to keep living plants in that soil, living roots in the soil for as many days out of a year as possible. Because if something is living in the soil, then photosynthesis is happening. If photosynthesis is happening, carbon is being pulled out of the atmosphere and sunk or sequestered in that soil. And that carbon, which ends up entering the soil in the form of root exudates, that's actually fuel or food for the billions of microorganisms that are actually in the soil doing the work. So the idea is we want to keep food going into that soil. We want to keep carbon going into that soil. Leave those guys alone. Let them do what they're doing. and we want to give them kind of a diversity of different root exudates. So that's why we talk about crop rotations. We want producers to grow malting barley, but we don't only want them to grow malting barley. Like, we love it when barley is in a minimum of a 3-crop rotation. So when you talk to someone like Derek and he's doing alfalfa for a few years, then switching to a small grain, then switching to peas, then maybe back to a small grain, you have all these different types of plants, different types of root exudates that are feeding the microbiome into the soil. And then if you can potentially bring cattle in, have it graze if that's possible, that would be the last thing we're talking about. Cows are great manure creators and spreaders. And when they graze, they're not killing those plants, but they are putting them in kind of a panicked state where they go into this hyper photosynthetic. So they're pulling even more carbon out of the atmosphere. So when you combine all these things, you get what our version of regenerative agriculture is. And when we're talking to a farm, we talk about this suite of different things they can do. And again, we start with tillage, but we meet them where they're at. For our program, if they can do one, they're in. If they're committed to looking at other options, potentially seeing what other cultural practices they can adopt, that's fantastic. Because, we're ultimately, our goal is to try and have as many of our acres as possible being grown on farms that are adopting or have adopted regenerative agriculture. But it's not a strict definition outside of the cultural practices.
Derek, I'm curious about this from your perspective as a farmer, what that impact of no-till means. Where is it's nice to say that the microbiome stays intact when you're not turning dirt over but in real practice, how does that lead to a healthier field? Does it lead to more utility from that field? Does it, does it lead to, a better quality nutrients and better quality grain? Talk to me from your perspective as a farmer.
Yeah. So when I went to no-till, one of the biggest reasons why I did it was for time. I didn't have a whole lot of time to just go sit in the tractor and do a bunch of dirt work. And so that was a big factor for me. It cut my tractor time into a third. So 2/3 faster because all they're going to do is me pass through the field. I can plant a whole field on 100 gallons of fuel now instead of taking, 300-400 gallons to do all the tillage and planting and everything. The soil structure, you just see stuff take off better, including the weeds, but it all takes off better. Every time you turn the soil, you lose at least a quarter inch of water. So by doing no-till, we just get to save a lot of water that's already in the ground. After the snow of the winter, we're trying to keep as much moisture as we can. And by doing no-till and keeping that soil structure, the soil actually hold water better, hold it longer. We can start building some good long-term organic matter instead of just having it off gas the CO2 when you till it. So, sorry if I kind of rambled there, but those are some of the biggest reasons why I went with it.
Yeah, you're in a high desert kind of area there in the valley. It's high elevation, but also very dry. And any one of us have seen
the highest one in the Western Hemisphere.
We've all seen the Great Sand Dunes Park over there, and you can see what happens to the dirt if it doesn't hold organic matter into it. It doesn't stick around for very long, does it?
Exactly.
And I think we're kind of getting into the benefits, which is kind of, we identify cultural practices, and then you want to identify benefits that you can measure, and I think, some of the sexier statistics come from, the greenhouse gas emissions reductions, the carbon sequestration. But in Colorado and in Delaware, water is a big deal. I think every brewer in Colorado thinks about water. So that's a commonality between them and the farms where we're sourcing their barley. But there's two different stories to water and regen ag. Whereas in Colorado, we don't have enough water, or we're always concerned about that. So, when Derek, I would be interested to hear, just your estimate of the difference in maybe inches or acre feet you put down on a regenerative circle versus what one of your neighbors is putting down on a conventionally tilled circle?
Yeah, I'd probably save irrigation or two. I'd say on the whole season, maybe an inch. It depends. It's kind of, these last few years been sporadic with rain. And so it's hard to judge even two fields 4 miles away from each other, because one field might have got 4 inches rain and the other one only got a half inch the whole year. And so how much we're having to irrigate with very greatly just field to field these last couple of years. So it's hard to pinpoint, but I can definitely say that it's in the half inch to inch range, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm. And so that, I mean, you talk about acre feet of water, you know, in a place like the San Luis Valley where it's 100% irrigated, that can equate to a massive savings. It's the exact opposite in Delaware. You know, our producers out on the Delmarva, they have plenty of water, but a lot of them are farming near the Chesapeake Bay and a lot of open waterways out there. So you're worried, and instead you're not worried about water, you're worried about leaching nitrates and pollutants out into waterways. And when you build soil health, and you build this soil structure, you know, you're turning your field into kind of like a sponge, and that sponge can hold water, like Derek talked about, and it also can hold its own nutrients. And I think what we see, you know, as carbon is sequestered and the microbiome is fed, it begins to produce some of its own nutrients. And so I think, you know, going back to the question on pesticides and just or fertilizer, you know, one of our farms we're working with, his name is Trey Hill, and he's in Maryland. And I would say he and Derek could almost not be more different in terms of their farms and just, you know, what they're doing and where they're at. You know, they both grow barley. That's what they have in common. But Trey's been, you know, no-till. He took over a no-till farm from his father and went whole hog into regen ag about 10 years ago. And when people come out and tour, Walker came out and toured with us about a year ago and just looked at Trey's farm. He makes sure that he takes us into his chemical shed. And he says, I don't want you to confuse this with organic. The goal here is not to eliminate chemicals. To reduce them, yes, that's one of the goals. He said that he uses about 20% of the chemicals that, you know, that his grandfather did. So he's like, you know, there used to be a lot more chemicals in this shed, but we are able to reduce our fertilizer and some of their chemical, but it's a much different growing environment out there as well. I think the rotations there, I mean, it's not unlikely to run into a farm where they're going to have barley one out of every 6 cycles. So more complex rotations. But yeah, I do think I like that Derek brought up his specific instance here in Colorado with chemicals. Because what we don't want with regen ag is for people to feel like we're not being transparent.
That's fair. And I guess you're right. It's when you're applying these things, what those are, you know, how they can have that impact. From your perspective, Walker, as a brewer, in a brewery, you know.
Yeah, brewer you'd be getting a lot of utility out of that word if you call me a brewer. So.
As one who works for a brewery,
there you go.
You know, what is your approach on this? What are some of the values that you know, that you all ascribe to on this agricultural side that make that piece appealing? You know, making an argument about the integrity of the soil microbiome doesn't necessarily, you know, directly translate into beer that you make, but clearly you all have some, you know, principles that you are trying to aspire to around that.
Sure. I think I'll highlight 2 things. We've been in business for about 30 years now, and the expectation is we're going to be in business in another 30. And if you look at how much change has occurred inside of our agricultural supply chain, it's pretty stunning. And I don't think anyone anticipates that rate of change to slow. And we see these practices as a risk mitigation against some of the volatility that's out there in the current climatic patterns. And so to some of the points that were made about water retention, whether you are in a water flush area and your risk is around flooding, or whether you are in a water scarce area and you need to maximize the value thereof, these practices tend to do both those things for you. Inputs, nitrogen fertilizers in particular, they're both tied to a limited resource. They come from fossil fuels, and they have an adverse implication for climatic stability. And so we see this as a way to make sure that our value chain partners are going to be our value chain partners into the medium and long-term future.
And that has a real, when you say this is not just a theoretical argument for New Belgium. Impacts of chaotic climate impacted your brewery in Asheville, and the entire brewery was underwater for quite a bit of time. And offline and not producing beer, and so you got to see firsthand just what this kind of more chaotic approach to, that we were seeing in the climate can actually have on brewing.
And I'll confess, on my bingo card of climate catastrophes, a flood in Asheville was bottom, did not see that coming. And so if your strategy around this is predicting the future, I think you're setting yourself up to fail. But if your strategy around this is setting up systems and structures that mitigate the risk, hopefully that will pay dividends in return. And that's very much why we think work like this around regenerative practices is so important to the future of brewing wholesale as well as our business.
Yeah, that makes sense. Derek, we've talked about this impact of water and how you can't count on it in any way that you might have used to have been able to, and that you even from field to field, you can see a very significant difference in the amount of rainfall on those. Are there any other kinds of kind of chaotic climate effects that you experience as a farmer these days?
Sprouts becoming more and more of an issue. Zach can talk more on the science on that, but with all these newer varieties that are malting faster and come out of dormancy faster, that's great for the maltster, but for a farmer, when you have way more rain than you're used to and everything starts sprouting in the head and you can't get any money for it, that really puts some stress on you because there's no insurance for sprout. We got hail insurance, multi-peril, but nothing for it sprouting out in the field. And so that's where the variety that you're using is huge on the supply and the growing side, because it may look great and awesome all year, but when you go to combine it and the elevator says it didn't test high enough and it sprouted too much and your $13 barley goes to $4, it really hurts you. So that's something that's out of the farmer's control. We grow whatever they tell us to, and I haven't figured out a way to tell the weather what to do yet. So that's definitely a big hurdle that we've had to face more now than we have in years past.
Yeah, sprout it's definitely, to me, pre-harvest sprout is a symptom of something that we're seeing. And it's, you build these entire value chains around what Mother Nature has traditionally done. It's kind of like, it's like we have a deal. I'm with Mother Nature. I'm going to plant this malting barley and it's going to get ripe. And we need it to not rain for a couple weeks so we can cut this. As soon as we get out of the field, knock yourself out. Historically, that is what happens. Farmers get their barley out of the field, and then it can rain all you like. And that is not just a Colorado problem. We had pre-harvest sprout problems with winter barley, which comes off 2 months earlier than spring barley this year out in the mid-Atlantic. So it's like if you can't predict things, it puts the supply chain at risk. And with pre-harvest sprout, that you can breed different types of dormancy. You can have a variety be incredibly dormant, which the farmer is absolutely safe. There's varieties that are so dormant, they could be ripe and it could pour rain on them for a month, maybe not a month, but 2 weeks. You can still pull them out, Now, you won't be able to malt them for another 5 months. So as a maltster, we have this huge gap. We have silos full of barley that in 4 months are going to be amazing, but are worthless. They may as well still be in the field for 4 months. Or like Derek's talking about, you can reduce that dormancy to a point where you can, Derek could literally, there are varieties where Derek could literally cut them, drive them over to our malt house and put them in a steep tank the same day, and we'd have 100% germ. That is wonderful unless it rains before he's able to get it out of the field. But again, I like that
So dormancies, I'm following along. If I think about the natural, this barley, this is a seed, and so it's gonna naturally it has over centuries and centuries grown to be quiet for a while and then sprout next spring. When it's gonna hit its typically, or a winter variety will sprout at a different time, obviously. And so it has a certain programmed amount of time that it's just going to sit there and not germinate and start that process that is the start of your malting process. And so you can manipulate that.
Exactly. If you think about every seed, it has a survival instinct. If it's out sitting still in the head of a plant in the field, if it starts to sprout, the odds of it actually producing another plant are zero. So, over time, that seed has said, and every seed is starch and protein, and the proteins stay locked up because that's where all the enzymes are that start the germination process. They'll say, I'm going to hang on and make sure that there's enough time that I actually get back into the dirt, which if you didn't harvest it at some point, that plant head would fall on the ground, and that seed would be near the dirt, and it could produce another plant if no humans were involved. So yeah, but that can be manipulated. And by manipulated, I mean bred in or out of different varietals. But it's a great example of how, regenerative agriculture is a tool, genetics, selecting plant genetics are a tool, but we're all trying to get around change that we don't understand. And I think, having worked in agriculture for the last 25 years, it just seems like there is less you can count on. It's like you don't have the same deal with Mother Nature that maybe we used to. So you have to have tools.
I know. When you mentioned this, I think about a conversation I had with Eric Toft, the private Landbrei Schönram, and he talked about buying malt from farms at different elevations, also keeping an 18-month supply of hops in their cooler. Some pretty dramatic kinds of effects to try to even out some of the increasing impact of climate change. Walker, from your perspective, are there some other things that New Belgium does to help iron out some of these ups and downs, in the agriculture and ingredient world?
Certainly. We're a pretty large company, so we draw from a wide variety of regions in hopes of insulating ourselves from region-specific activities. And these conversations we have with the proximity team and our other growers aren't limited just to barley. Of course, we're also having similar conversations reflected through slightly different dimensions of risk with our other supply chain partners that are in the agronomic spaces.
Sure. Are there any other kinds of climate-driven risks that your other farmers are seeing, Zach, in addition to sprout?
Well, I think everyone's concerned that things are getting warmer. That's a huge deal. I think with spring barley, everybody remembers what happened in 2021. That was a disaster year where a lot of heat, a lot of drought, and you can see what can happen to a whole industry. There were ripples for a few years after that. So I think having a contingency plan, is important. And I hear people say, there may be a time where you can't grow barley. And I think that is inaccurate. I think we can change. Regenerative agriculture is a tool. The utilization of winter malting barley is another tool. So I think work that malting companies and their brewing partners and farmers and AMBA and universities are doing to find these new solutions are going to hopefully make it so nobody drives off a cliff. But heat is, you can't ignore it.
Sure. No, I think the actual just data and science is out there of the global temperature increasing, and that creating additional unplanned kind of weather events that seem to be more extreme and happening in ways that are less predictable, and here we are. From let's flip gears a little bit and talk about the kind of financial picture that it comes with this. Generally speaking, anyone attracted to organic or regenerative or some of these kind of agricultural buzzwords, not, I shouldn't say it's a buzzword, but this kind of branded term around this expects cost to be involved. And I think that from your perspective as a maltster, like what does this actually look like in terms of cost? You're also as a malt house having to incentivize growers into these practices, and as Derek has outlined, like there's no guarantees on some of this stuff that when things go bad, they have a livelihood to make, and they can't always insure against some downside outcomes. And so in terms of taking riskier, maybe not riskier farming practices, but practices that some of those farmers are less comfortable with and have less experience with and may need to learn as they go. How do you manage that kind of risk piece for them?
Yeah. I mean, that is such an important part of this whole project, because what we all have to understand as a supply chain is that the risk is being taken at the farm level. Derek, when he decided to change the way he was farming, there was some risk involved with that. I think, early on when I used to talk to Derek, he would say that some of his farmer neighbors kind of thought of him as like a mad scientist because he was trying these things and succeeding with them, but they were new. They were not a cultural norm, I would say, in the San Luis Valley.
They still think I'm crazy, just FYI. They still think I'm crazy.
But more of them are starting
do they think your beer is good?
The ones that'll try some besides Coors or Bud Light.
But that when you think about what Derek was doing, he went out and decided to use Regen Ag on his own. So it was very rewarding, when we started working with the USDA and their partnerships for climate smart commodities, to be able to go to Derek and be like, hey, this stuff that you're doing is valuable to us, and we have brewing partners who think it's valuable, and I would like to be able to, in Derek's case, he already took the jump. He may have still been experiencing some risk, but to be able to come to him and be like, hey, I'm going to be able to pay you more for your barley because you're growing it this way. And, if we can measure what you're doing and collect some data from you once a year so we can tell that story, then your barley is worth more to us than it was. And so I think at that point, it was fun I don't know how it was for Derek, but, in my mind's eye, it had to be a little satisfying to be able to be like, hey, all this crazy shit I've been doing that you guys talk about at the coffee shop, yeah, I'm going to make more on my barley than you are this year because I'm doing it.
What has that impact been for your business, Derek? Is it, from a financial perspective?
I haven't really seen any decline in yield from going at the more conventional way to this. And the USDA bumps that we're getting with it right now is definitely helping. Truthfully, the biggest thing for me in my personal situation is just time. Like when I can just go in one pass, plan it and be done and get going, that's what saves me so much time, so much money, effort, just everything. So, and I like being able not to have all my dirt blow in the spring. I like it sticking around, and some of my neighbors always say that my fields look ugly until it's about harvest time. And that's fine. I'm not doing it to be pretty during the year. It's about the end product. So, but this regenerative practices movement has it's just freed up a lot of time, and which is my most valuable resource. And so it's allowed me to do other things to help. Anymore farming, you almost have to have something else to help make it pay. So if you got more time to do other things, you can help try and get more money to pay for everything.
No, that's fair. And I think, especially as the, post-COVID labor crunch that we've seen, it's not as if farming areas are attracting large population influxes of more folks to handle the increased, volume, because the world population goes up and the U.S. population rises every year. Our food production and all has to go up to match that too. But we're not necessarily creating a whole bunch of new farmers out there in the process. So becoming more efficient in terms of time certainly, is a piece there. But there are some government programs then, or at least a government program now that helps support this.
There is, and I think it'd be interesting to talk about it because it has transitioned between the two administrations. In the Biden administration, it was the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. We were one of 141 pilot projects accepted, and they essentially asked us to create what they referred to at that time as a climate smart commodity, which was our malt, and currently beers being brewed with it are climate smart commodities. They wanted us to be able to incentivize the use of regenerative agriculture, and then they wanted us to capture data. And so the subsidy they provided allowed us, one, to incentivize the producers, but also to pay for the data collection. We refer to it as the MMRV process, so measuring, monitoring, reporting, and verifying what's happening in that soil. And that data set kind of served us in two ways. One, we were required to report to the USDA, and we still are. And then it also allowed us to share the story of what farmers like Derek are doing on their farms with our customers in a few different ways.
Interesting. And in terms of that story, talk to me, Walker, about how you all look at it. You did mention that you want to be here another 30 years and, building some, building a way to kind of hedge for all of this change is important, at the scale of business that New Belgium and Bells are at. But then you also have other metrics that you internally strive for, that you try to communicate within the company and also outside of the company, in terms of being a steward in this whole piece of making beer, but connecting back with agriculture.
We do track and measure quite a myriad of indicators for our own environmental performance and impacts, as well as our value chains performance and impact. And that's been a big piece of this project and a real benefit of the Climate Smart Commodities grant. It positioned Proximity to procure some of the data that's required. I'll often say I need it to be authentic and accurate. And when you walk onto one of these fields and you put a shovel in the dirt, you can see that you've got something authentic. But in the absence of the data, you can't make any claims that are accurate. And you're playing in a space that's all vibes and no measured values. And that's difficult for us as a business for a couple of reasons. One, we're not in a position to make strong authoritative claims unless we can meet the burden of both authentic and accurate. And we also see the greenhouse gas measurement as a proxy for a number of different business health indicators. And so often we get way too caught up on the greenhouse gas piece. That's typically what Zach and I traffic in. But when you listen to Derek, he's talking about water and hours given back to his quality of life. We don't have good measures for those the way we have good measures for greenhouse gas. Even that's as much an art as a science right now, but it's the best measurement tool we have. And so we assign a lot of secondary importance to that greenhouse gas number. When you make your greenhouse gas per unit produced measure go down, you are implicitly using less inputs. That's good for your business. Or you are implicitly using less inputs that are dependent on a limited resource, i.e. fossil fuel. So you might not make your kilowatt hours per bushel produced go down with a solar array or procuring renewable electricity for your business, but you will make your greenhouse gas per unit produced go down by investing in those strategies. If you're using alternative nitrogen types, if you're using cover crops, if you're not tilling the soil, all of those things are going to bring that greenhouse gas number down. And we know that implicitly that reflects a number of additional things that say to us, this business is positioned well from a, climate stability dimension. And that has value to us as well. We want our number to say that to our partners up and down the value chain, and getting good data so that we can produce and assess that number for our value chain partners helps us identify those partners who are running their business in a way that we think positions them to be our partner for a longer period of time.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way, that number one, it's not the greenhouse gas itself that is the ultimate thing, but it is just this signifier that reflects so many other things. And it's a shorthand that you can quickly understand, because normal customers may get lost in our water usage conversation, but they certainly understand the idea of greenhouse gas because we've all been scared by it for so many decades now.
Yeah, and I play in this space, and I couldn't tell you how significant 2 acre inches is compared to 3.5 in the grand scheme of a water balance at Derek's farm. But I know that Derek's going to have a lower measure for greenhouse gas per unit produced, and I have a pretty high confidence then that he's also going to have a soil system that's better prepared to manage the variable weather patterns, specifically around water, whether that's excess water, whether that's scarce water. And so, yeah, it's a good proxy. It's almost like debt equity ratios for a company. If you see a greenhouse gas number and you know how to read it, it tells you a lot more than just how much that organization is or isn't contributing to climate change. We care about that too, obviously, quite a lot. But that number is really important because it tells us a story that goes beyond just the climate impacts about the business and how the business is being run.
It's like talking about IBU, but not having to describe what isomerized versus non-isomerized
Sure, yes.
alpha acids are for people. This is just the IBU. You get an idea for where this is.
Is it a big number? Is it a little number? What am I getting into with this purchase?
It just sums a lot of things up into a more simple metric.
And I think what's exciting for us is that I think as a maltster, you get to be a conduit between where this is happening, which is on a farm with our producers, and with organizations that see the value in what's happening. I really liked that Walker talked about just the soil health impact in terms of risk mitigation, because the number one question we get from customers is, well, what's the impact on the barley? I mean, they assume that there's going to be something negative if you're changing these practices with the barley, that the barley or the malt may not be as good. And I think we have not, and we're 3 years in, we have not seen a difference between our regeneratively grown and conventionally grown quality. It's been very similar. I think there's a lot of other factors that can impact it. Regenerative agriculture can't protect against huge swings in weather. But where we have seen an impact, and Walker just described it, is in areas where if they go through a little bit of a drought, that soil structure and that moisture, it's more resilient. There's less of an impact. And normally depending on the growth stage of a barley plant, if you lose water for a while, your protein is likely going to go up. You might lose some test weight or some yield. And I think on some of our regenerative farms who are farming near neighbors that are growing conventionally, they have weathered some of those events better, which means the quality is better, which is proof of concept for what Walker's talking about. You're talking about resilience, and this is soil resilience.
When we were down visiting Trey, we literally had this really unique opportunity to stand in one of his barley fields and then look across the road and see a different grower who had used more conventional practices, and they were having an exceptionally dry year. Was that November or October of last year? And it was just such a clear, visible difference. Trey had a little bit of sprout, and you could see some of the barley coming up, and the other field looked like it was fallow. And it may not have been a banner crop for Trey, but I bet compared to whomever was growing on the other side of the road, it looked like a spectacular yield for that particular season.
Interesting. Let's talk about the value proposition, for a minute. What this actually means in terms of, practical, expense, because you're getting high quality barley, you're getting the same quality you would expect, from, conventionally grown. Obviously there's, there is some additional cost involved, but there are also some offsets from government funding here. What's the overall financial picture look like for this?
Yeah. We're all pilot projects. There was 141 of us that joined the PCSC program. Not everybody made it through the change in administration to the Advancing Markets for Producers program. We were fortunate that our project was not impacted in any way. So what that provides is a subsidy or a time frame for us to develop a value chain and a value proposition for all the stakeholders. We've identified that the change is happening on farms. The risk is being taken by farmers. And so that needs to be rewarded. And so ultimately, you're trying to, in one way, you're trying to take something that's happening on a farm and make that mean something to someone who's making a purchasing decision at the absolute opposite end of the value chain. So that's where we talk about the data. The data, if it's presented correctly, it can travel with the raw material through the value chain. But at the end of the day, we've got 5 years to make this product mean something enough to either a consumer or a commercial partner that they're willing to pay enough that we can continue to pay farmers. So I think, when you're talking about the value proposition, when we first launched the program, we were I remember it because it was about a year and a half ago, and we finally had the math right. We had our marketing done and in place. We knew we had something, and there was this month where we were I wonder if anybody's going to give a shit about this. It was amazing to us because you've been living and breathing it for a year and a half, and now you have something, and you're God, I hope somebody buys it. And it's slowly over the past year, it's taken off. So we're slowly starting to be able to rely less on the subsidy and more on just general interest and value from our partners in the U.S. And hopefully, if it works, because it was 141 experiments, if ours works, we will not need the USDA in 2 years, and we'll be able to continue this brand, continue doing the research, continue paying the farmers, and it's just something that exists without subsidy.
What does it mean for the farmer in terms of what they get paid for that barley? What would they get paid, for a conventional barley versus the regenerative kind of approach?
Mm-hmm. I think, and again, I imagine there's other people doing this, other malting companies. For us, they're receiving between 10 and 20% more for their barley. And the reason there's a spread is because our pricing is always based in part on commodity markets, though barley isn't malting barley, and barley is not traded. Soft red winter wheat is, and that's what we're competing against in the Mid-Atlantic. So, you're talking about, and we feel that is significant.
You want them to grow barley and not this other crop. That
we do.
Yeah.
We want to be better than wheat. We want to be better than other things in Colorado. So you're competing for the acre. And we've found that the 10 to 15% is enough to generate interest. And, what a producer is giving for that is they're sharing their data with us, and they're making a commitment that we're able to monitor over multiple years for how they're farming. And that will continue on because we want to keep generating the data. We want to tell a long-term story of soil health. So again, that kind of goes back to the partnerships that we're building with the farms and the individual conversations with every one of them.
Then when it comes to your malt houses, it's the same process and there's no difference between that and conventional barley. But then it leaves and goes out to customers, brewers, who are then buying that malt made with this regenerative barley or regenerative practice grown barley. And what is the impact of, in terms of what the brewer then pay, or brewery, sorry, I want to get that correct, the brewery.
Appreciate that.
Then pays for that malt.
Yeah, I mean, it's, depending on scale, it's different. I mean, it is I would say it's relatively
Sure, if you're running
small.
at a New Belgium scale, then you might get
Right.
some volume discounts on this.
Right. There's certainly economies that can be applied to the customer, but it's not significantly different. I mean, you're talking based on your size between 2 and 4 cents a pound. Which I know right now, as tight as things are in our industry, that's probably a lot for some people, but that's what it costs to provide this financial resource to the farms. And another thing that we make sure we separate is the data from their barley. There can be catastrophes that happen, and we've had a few cases where producers have signed up for the program, say they have 100 acres in the program, it got hailed out or something happened that was out of their control, and we have to reject their barley. Even if their barley is rejected, the data that their payment for their regenerative practices is still there.
The way to think about that is almost you're growing barley and you're producing this environmental attribute, and the data is what you need to prove the attribute exists. But there's separate revenue streams for the grower once they're willing to participate, because even if you lose the crop, you still had the creation of the environmental attribute as a function of the growing practices in that crop year. And if you've got the data to show the receipts that those environmental attributes exist, now you have two things.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And hopefully in the future, that data can then be continually shared out with more growers in that industry. And those practices that we consider conventional may ultimately all be able to change into a more resilient practice. That's certainly the goal, to test these within this kind of microcosm program in order to see, find those things that work so that our future practice can be more effective and more resilient than our current practice. Walker, for you all in New Belgium, how do you then, and Bells, how do you then articulate this? This is not part of, I'm not saying, hey, this is made with regenerative malt on my Voodoo Ranger can. That's not necessarily the way that you all are going about this, but is there some messaging to end consumers about, how you all go about this, and then in terms of overall, how much, of your overall malt usage is regenerative, this regenerative based agriculture play so far? And do you see it growing in the future? Do you see it as a test project for yourselves? How are you all approaching it?
So with the consumer, that is a difficult needle to thread. We include that type of content in our annual sustainability report. We call that the Human Powered Business Report. We put it out there on our website, but you won't find it stenciled on secondary packaging or on the can. We don't necessarily see that purchasing preference come through. People are largely shopping based on quality and price. And if you can check those two, you have the opportunity to differentiate around sustainability. But that's a difficult narrative to thread all the way through, because as we said before, regenerative means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and there's not a clear understanding of what you're spending on when you say regenerative with the customer today. And so I think there's some growth in education that has to take place, or if it doesn't take place, will make it harder to leverage some of these points of differentiation at retail. And so I would be careful assigning too much retail differentiation because these topics are so nuanced, and the only way to do them right is to lean into the nuance. If you lean away from it, you get an eco label that has no value. It might have enough marketing behind it, but there's no, again, authenticity and accuracy. And that's only something you can drive with nuance. And so it's got to be a slower, incremental conversation. And we're having that conversation with our growers and our partners. It's probably been the bane of Zach's existence to try and satisfy my requirements for accuracy, but that we are getting data that is of a ISO certified standard really puts us in a position to then start making claims and talking about it with our beer lovers in a way that has that authority that comes with authenticity and accuracy. And so that's still very much a journey. We're at the earliest stages of it, very much the trailhead. And forgive me, I forgot the second half of the question.
Such a Colorado metaphor.
It is, yeah.
The second part of the question was, how much of your approach to malted barley does regenerative agriculture currently make up? And do you see that remaining static? Do you see that growing in the future? Are there some moving goals for that for you all?
That's a great question. And maybe the most difficult one to answer you've thrown at me yet, because there is a varying scale of regenerative practices, and some of them are in place, and we don't have the data or the documentation to demonstrate that they're already happening. And some of them are happening as a function of interventions, like the work that Zach does, walking out onto fields and talking to folks. And so of our value chain that has regenerative practices and a data stream that allows us to validate, we're in single percentage points. It's quite small. But there's been a lot of good work done. Zach leads a committee for the AMBA Sustainability Task Force that's spent the better part maybe of 2 years now just trying to get enough baseline data so that we as an industry can agree to the variables that matter and what the calculation looks like to go from inputs to greenhouse gas. And then that gives our grower partners the ability to control their process to meet that end point. And then we might discover that number was, somewhere double digits or 40%. But when it comes down to really being able to make authoritative claims and say that I've got the data to demonstrate that this barley was grown in a way that fits into a lower greenhouse gas barley product and could, have the banner of regenerative practices over the work, that's still a very small portion because the data that's required, kind of novel, and for a lot of growers, kind of private, like not things they love telling people publicly. And so Zach's done a wonderful job of being able to stand up enough of the value chain and get engagement that we're moving towards a place where hopefully we'll have an agreed equation, we'll have agreed variables, and then it gets a lot more standardized for us to pull this information through the value chain to the end user. And as that continues to happen, we're going to be better positioned to bring the customer along with us in a way that, again, broken record is authentic and accurate. So the customer trusts that whatever claim we're making is going back from their dollar spent into that field. And that's when you might really begin to generate a point of differentiation through the work. But it's a lot of work. And without the runway gifted to us by the Climate Smart Commodity Program, it'd be even harder to take the leap that Proximity has taken to develop growers and develop the data flows. I don't want to use the word impossible unless Zach nods at me from across the table. He smiled, but he didn't say impossible. So maybe it could have been done without the grant, but it certainly would have been a tougher road for him.
Single digits percentages for New Belgium would still make you a regional brewery. Even 1% would still make you a regional craft brewery by most people's standards. So we're not talking about small amounts here. That's still very significant.
We got a long way to go. Single digits feels small to me. We got to make a lot of change out there.
It's good to have audacious goals as well. Zach, and maybe we should wrap it up here. What, from a kind of a big picture perspective, what do you hope that this project achieves, through Proximity, in terms of how would you consider it a success when you look back on it in a couple of years? When
we first pitched our pilot to to the USDA. We told them in 5 years we wanted to have half of our farms utilizing Regenerative, which I think we're going to be able to do that. So that is one success, which is our success. In proximity, like we've talked, we are not a huge multinational. We had a lot of things moving in our favor. The fact that we have two, smaller, between 50 and 70 farms in each supply shed, so we can have the relationships, we can know the farmers. I know the first name of every person who we buy barley from, and most of them I've gone out and looked at it. So, to be able to, for our personal success, to be able to provide more value to them, because they're committed partners to us. They're doing it. It is not easy. It's easy for some of them, but in general, it's not easy to grow perfect barley, and that's what we're asking them, and it happens a lot. So to be able to provide more and shine a light on some of the things they're doing, because in a lot of ways they're leaders, like Derek the mad scientist, according to his neighbors, he's doing an incredible thing in Colorado. And guys like Trey Hill in Maryland is doing an incredible thing in the Mid-Atlantic. So being able not only to give them a platform for what they're doing, make it, take some of the risk out, make it more effective, just in terms of their ability to earn revenue as a farm is a success for us. And then I think, Walker spoke to, a larger success would be is if our work and the fact that, we kind of went out on a limb on our own, and it was scary for a couple of years. If we could, be a part of this story nationally for the brewing industry, I think that would be a big success for us.
Well, there's no beer without farms, and love this opportunity to shine some light on that, and such an interesting topic to talk about here, and I can't wait to see how this develops in the future. But for now, that is a great place to bring this to a close. Once again, this episode was brought to you interruption-free by Proximity Malt, the first new generation, full-scale regional malting facility in North America that leads the way in malt supply with premium grains, advanced technology that maximizes flavor, performance, flexibility, and efficiency, regional sourcing for closer, fresher grain, and a deep focus on closing the loop between farm, maltster, brewer, and the communities that support each. Learn more at proximitymalt.com, and if you're a brewer that wants to give their malt a try, check out the Contact Us page on their website to find your local sales rep. Walker, Derek, Zach, thanks for sharing your thoughts on regenerative malt. Cheers.
Cheers. It's been a pleasure.
All right, thanks, guys. Appreciate it, and just cheers.
Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.